Hey there, fellow travelers. Welcome to the Tolkien Road, episode 328. In this episode, we'll be exploring the foundation of the Grey Havens and of Lindon in year one of the Second Age. Before I get started, I'd like to give a double up air five to our amazing fellowship. Stick 'em up. Three, two, one. Whoopsht. Special thanks to this episode's executive producers, John R., Kaitlyn of Tea with Tolkien, Jacob Lockham, John H., and Eru27. Also, a shout out to those celebrating their fellowship anniversary in February of 2023. Ish of the Hammer, Jacob Lockham, Robert H., Asya V, Eric B, John R., Andrew M, Shane Wise, Lucas W, Sean S, Sarah W, John R, David Bigwood, Kat L, Sarah M, and Eric B. Thank you all so much for sticking with us over the last year. Join the Fellowship of the Road by visiting patreon.com/TolkienRoad. When you join the Fellowship of the Road, it helps us to keep on evering on and lend you some cool perks along the way. Learn more at patreon.com/TolkienRoad. YouTube, hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe and let us know what's on your mind in the comments below. All right, so on this episode, we are looking at the year one of the Second Age of the Fall of Númenor. That is, of course, this amazing book right here. Beautiful, beautiful artifact that it is. And we're finally getting into the substance, right? To the meat, to the actual history of the Fall of Númenor, all 3,500 years of it. And in this episode, we're covering the first year, Second Age 1. This section pulls from several different sources in order to compile its material. Among these are The Lord of the Rings, the appendices of The Lord of the Rings, the Silmarillion, History of Middle-earth, in particular the last volume of the History of Middle-earth, Volume 12, Unfinished Tales, and Tolkien's Letters. So pulling from a lot of different sources to kind of to lay the groundwork of this whole history of Númenor that we're about to embark on. And it begins by telling us a little bit about the end of the First Age. So let's look at the text itself here. And so, foundation of the Grey Havens and of Lindon. The Second Age picks up continuous from where the Silmarillion ends. And so the Silmarillion ends with the destruction of Angband, the overthrow of Morgoth, and the upheaval of the land of this really subcontinent of Beleriand. And so it's depicted in the image, the main image of this chapter, which you see right here. This image is by Alden Lee, and it's entitled "The Host of the Valar Descendant to Angband." And you can kind of see right here, right? You can see the host of the Valar descending down into this like kind of dungeonous appearing place. That's what's being depicted, is the final assault on Morgoth's stronghold at the end of the First Age. So that's what we have. It picks up, and that's where it all ends. The Silmarillion, that's the very end of the Silmarillion, and now we're beginning into the Second Age, year one. The first thing the chapter really talks about is the elves and what becomes of the elves at the end of the First Age and beginning with the Second Age. We hear some about this area called Lindon, and Lindon is what we would probably think of as the northwest of Middle-earth in the Third Age. Lindon is this area, so just to kind of give you your bearings here, we have, you can see here, if I zoom in a little bit, you can see that we've got Bree right here, we've got the Shire right here, we've got Rivendell kind of faintly right there. And if you keep going this way, you see the Grey Havens, right? You see the Tower Hills. And this region to the west of the Blue Mountains is the region of Lindon, right? For Lindon on the north, Har Lindon on the south. And if you imagine for yourself this whole area to the west, really we see a little island over here, the Tolfuin. This region over here used to be the continent, the subcontinent of Beleriand. And if you look at the map of the First Age that's included in the Silmarillion, you'll see how this all makes sense. The Blue Mountains are on the eastern border of Beleriand, and now they are the western border of the region that we're most familiar with of Eriador. So this is where a lot of the elves that were involved in the intrigues and the wars of the First Age, the ones who survived, a lot of them settled in this region initially at the beginning of the Second Age. And these elves are summoned to the Grey Havens to make the travel to to make the journey to the Blessed Realm, back to the Blessed Realm. So many of them had left, had self-exiled from the Blessed Realm at the beginning of the First Age, and now they were headed back to the Blessed Realm. And let's look at the reason for this, because it's kind of interesting, and it tells us a little bit about what was going on, and even informs our understanding of the Rings of Power. So, Tolkien says there was nothing wrong, essentially, in the elves lingering against council, still sadly with the mortal lands of their old heroic deeds, but they wanted to have their cake without eating it. They wanted the peace and bliss and perfect memory of the West, and yet to remain on the ordinary earth where their prestige as the highest people, above wild elves, dwarves, and men, was greater than at the bottom of the hierarchy of Valinor. So there was nothing wrong, according to Tolkien, per se, with the elves wanting to stay. It was just that they had mixed motives. They wanted to create their own blessed realm within Middle Earth, but the good thing about creating their own blessed realm there for them was, in their minds, that, well, we get to be in charge over here because we have the greatest prestige. We're obviously these immortal beings amongst all of these mortal creatures. We know the things of the blessed realm. We've learned from the gods, the Valar, and now we're going to create our own little blessed realms over here. That in their mind was better than going back to the blessed realm and kind of being at the bottom of the pecking order, if you will. Not, it's the blessed realm, so how much of a pecking order can there really be? But there is a hierarchy, right? There is a hierarchy, and as blessed as that hierarchy may be, maybe they still viewed it as being, over here we can at least be in charge of our own destiny. So there's a little bit of an independent mindset, right, going on with the elves that chose to stay behind. So many of them, some do eventually make the journey, but many of them stay behind and continue to do elvish things, right, in the best sense of the word, in Middle Earth, and create these, beautiful little kingdoms. We think of somewhere like Rivendell. We think of somewhere like Lorien, like Lothlorien eventually, right? These are kingdoms that are where the elves do their best work and create their own sorts of little blessed realms within the unblessed realm of Eriador and of the wider regions of Middle Earth. So the chapter also speaks of some important elves. Among these are several familiar names. The first may not be too familiar to you, but you've likely heard of it, and once I make the connection, it'll all make sense. The first they mention is Thranduil. So Thranduil, you'll probably recognize, if you've seen Peter Jackson's Hobbit movies, you would recognize him as one of the characters in there. He is the father of Legolas, the king of Mirkwood, right? The elvish king of Mirkwood. He's portrayed as kind of this haughty figure in that movie. He migrates east here early on in the Second Age, migrates east even over the Misty Mountains, right? Go back to our map here, just kind of give you the lay of the land. He migrates east back all the way from here across Eriador over the Blue Mountains to Greenwood the Great, as it's known back then. Of course, we know it later on as the Misty Mountains. Let me zoom out a little bit so you can see the whole thing. All right, so you see there, this is Mirkwood over here, Greenwood the Great in the Second Age, and he migrates over there and makes his own kingdom over there. So Thranduil, yes, he is the father of Legolas, and his story, his lifetime extends all the way back into the First Age. So, interesting note if you didn't already know that about Thranduil. Another elf that you've likely heard of, and actually features in the Rings of Power TV show, is Gil-galad. He is the High King of the Noldor. So you might be wondering, who are the Noldor? You may have heard this name before. It's not really spelled out for us in a lot of detail in the Lord of the Rings. Maybe we've heard a little, I can't remember if we've heard some about it in the TV show Rings of Power. Nevertheless, the Noldor are the main group of elves that self-exile from the Blessed Realm in the First Age. They journey from the Blessed Realm back to Beleriand, and they take on Morgoth. And they're the ones that really are obsessed with obtaining the Silmarils. They're led by Feanor initially. Feanor dies, and there are other people, other Noldor, who become the High King of the Noldor, and eventually in the Second Age, it is Gil-galad who is the High King of the Noldor. So that's who the Noldor are. They're one of these three groups of the early elves who are summoned to Valinor, and they make that final journey, and they're amongst these blessed elves, but they fall and they reject that blessedness in order to get their vengeance against Morgoth and obtain for themselves the Silmarils. Other elves that are mentioned are Galadriel and Celeborn. So we all know who Galadriel is, most likely. And Galadriel, and then Celeborn is, of course, her husband. You'll know him especially from the Lord of the Rings. He has not been in the Rings of Power yet. He was not in the Rings of Power Season 1, was mentioned at one point in passing as being dead. We'll see. I doubt he's actually dead. Sorry for any spoilers. But he is most definitely in the Lord of the Rings. So let's read a little bit about the description of Galadriel here in the Second Age. Of Galadriel, it is said that she was strong of body, mind, and will, a match for both the lore masters and the athletes of the Eldar in the days of their youth. Even among the Eldar, she was accounted beautiful, and her golden hair was held a marvel unmatched. And the Eldar said that the light of the two trees, Laurelin and Telperion, had been snared in her tresses. From her earliest years, she had a marvelous gift of insight into the minds of others, but judged them with mercy and understanding. So Galadriel is you can kind of think of it as, let me actually switch my camera there. There we go. You can kind of think of Galadriel as being one of probably Tolkien's proudest creations. She actually was a later introduction as an elf into the Legendarium, but after he introduced her, he really spent a lot of time on her backstory and developing her participation in the history, even going back and kind of injecting her into the stories of the First Age. And she really does. She's a very important character. She was obviously a very important character in Tolkien's mind. And, she was pretty amazing as he has her described right here. I want to highlight, though, how he talks about her hair here. So it says she was accounted beautiful, and her golden hair was held a marvel unmatched. They said the other elves said that the light of the two trees, Laurelin and Telperion, had been snared in her tresses. This is an important little note here, a really interesting note, if you will, because the Silmarils were the same thing was said of the Silmarils, right? That the light of the two trees was captured within the Silmarils, and that's why they gave off this beautiful radiance. Well, the only thing otherwise that captured that same quality of the two trees, that light of the two trees, was apparently the hair of Galadriel, right? So that says something to us about her beauty, about maybe her stature as well. And it's just something that's very interesting to note because of the role that the Silmarillions play in the Legendarium, and that Galadriel's hair is compared to the Silmarillion and the Silmarils and the two trees in this way. All right, and then the last couple of elves I wanted to highlight are actually not full elves; they're half elven. Elrond and Elros. Now, Elros chooses a path that rejects his elf heritage, if you will, or the immortality, right? The immortality aspect. Of course, he remains descendant, having elvish blood within him, but he chooses the path of mortality and becomes the first king of Númenor. Elrond is referred to frequently as the half-elven, and he is of these two brothers, the children of Eärendil and Elwing. Elrond is the one that chooses to follow the elvish path and chooses immortality instead. So they are important figures and will be very important figures in the stories of the Second Age. Why were they half-elven? And let's talk a little bit. This is really interesting. Let's talk a little bit about why the term half-elven isn't actually super precise when it comes to them. All right. So going over to Tolkien Gateway, the ever-useful Tolkien Gateway. This is the family tree of Elrond and Elros here. So let me scroll down a little bit so you can get a good picture. All right, so here's Elrond in the center of it, Elros over here. You see they're both descended from Eärendil and Elwing. Well, we'll look at Eärendil's side first. So Eärendil is the son of Tuor and Idril. Tuor was a man, fully man, 100% man, Idril was an elf maiden. So Eärendil was indeed half elven, right? He was indeed half elven. Elwing, on the other hand, is not exactly half elven. So let's follow the family tree back up, okay? So Nimloth, elf, full elf, Elwing's mother, full elf, descended from Galadriel over here. So full elf on her mother's side, but on her father's side, her father is Dior. You might remember we talked a little bit about Dior in the last episode. Well, Dior is descended from Beren and Luthien. Beren was full man, okay? Luthien was half elf and half goddess, half Maya. Melian, her mother, was a Maya, was an actual goddess, and her father was an elf. So let's kind of follow this through. Luthien, half elf, half Maya. Beren, full man. Dior, what does that make him? Well, it makes him half man, quarter elf, quarter Maiar. Okay, so Elwing, what does that make Elwing? Let's see, let's do the math here. So full elf on her mother's side, and then it gets complicated over here on Dior's side. I think it essentially adds up to 5/8 elf for Elwing, 1/8. No, wait, I'm sorry. 1/8 Maiar, and 3/8 man for Elwing. Okay. And then you can only imagine from there it gets complicated. But the important thing, in all of this, without doing all of the math and all of that for how much Maya blood is there for Elrond and Elros, is that we go down the family tree and there is a strain, this divine strain, right, that exists within the heritage of Elrond and Elros, right, within their lines. So we can kind of look at this and say, oh, that's interesting. We've got Aragorn, right? It's eventually descended way down the history, is eventually descended from Elros. So Aragorn actually has some of this Maya blood within him, right? Small strain, but nevertheless it's there. Same can be said of Arwen, right? So just an interesting little detail. And it tells us again how important this story of Beren and Luthien is to, understanding and kind of seeing how all of this is so beautifully woven together by Tolkien. All right, and the last thing I want to mention is the founding of the Grey Havens. We know the Grey Havens from Lord of the Rings, and this is where the elves are summoned from, right, to make that trip back to the Blessed Realm. All right, so let's look at this passage about the Grey Havens. Upon the shores of the Gulf of Loon, the elves built their havens and named them Mithlond, and there they held many ships, for the harborage was good. From the Grey Havens the Eldar ever and anon set sail, fleeing from the darkness of the days of earth. For by the mercy of the Valar, the firstborn could still follow the straight road and return, if they would, to their kindred in Erisea and Valinor, beyond the encircling seas. So the Grey Havens were set up as for this departure point to the Blessed Realm for the elves. Of course, later on, other figures depart from there to the Blessed Realm as well. All right. Well, next time we'll be beginning our look at year 32, which will probably take us a couple of episodes because there's a lot in that year to talk about, especially with regard to Númenor. But it's essentially the founding of Númenor. So we're going to be taking a close look at the founding of Númenor over the next several episodes and just more about what Tolkien had to say about the island of Númenor and what it was like. All right. Well, let's look at some correspondence. How about that? All right. Well, this week we're going to look at an interesting question from a patron, Andrew M, that he sent this on January 9th. So Andrew's question has to do with the fate of Saruman. Andrew points out that there's this passage in The Return of the King. To the dismay of those that stood by, about the body of Saruman a grey mist gathered, and rising slowly to a great height like smoke from a fire, as a pale shrouded figure it loomed over the hill. For a moment it wavered, looking to the west, but out of the west came a cold wind, and it bent away, and with a sigh dissolved into nothing. Andrew says, we assume that means the Valar rejected his spirit in returning to the west in the halls of Mandos to be judged. So what happens to him? Nothing? The void? Barrow-Wight, maybe? Roam Middle-earth as a spirit? There's more than likely something I haven't read, but I haven't seen it or heard about it, and I am real curious. Thank you. It's a great question, and I'm not exactly sure, what the best answer is to this question. But the thing that strikes me is that Saruman's fate is very similar to Sauron's fate as depicted in Lord of the Rings. So let me read what it says about Sauron's fate in Lord of the Rings. "The realm of Sauron is ended," said Gandalf. "The ring-bearer has fulfilled his quest." And as the captains gazed south to the land of Mordor, it seemed to them that black against the pall of cloud there rose a huge shape of shadow, impenetrable, lightning-crowned, filling all the sky. Enormous, it reared above the world and stretched out towards them a vast, threatening hand, terrible but impotent. For even as it leaned over them, a great wind took it, and it was all blown away and passed. And then a hush fell. So, I look at the fate of Saruman, and it's very similar to me of what happens to Sauron, right? It's kind of this initial, this smoke, angry smoke kind of rising up, and it looks ominous, and it looks like it's going to do something else, and then it's just kind of blown away, right? Now, in Saruman's case, he looks towards the west. It describes him. It almost sounds like he's kind of like longing, like almost repentant, wanting to go there. Sauron, not so much, right? Sauron looks like he's ready to strike another blow, and then he gets blown away, right? Just like this mist that vanishes. Yeah, why wouldn't they return to the halls of Mondos to be judged? Well, I don't know that was the fate of these divine beings to be judged by Mondos necessarily. I know that was the fate of the elves. The elves were, when they died, they would pass to the halls of Mondos, and there they would reside to be judged. And I could be wrong about this, but I'm not sure. We don't really get that precedent for Valar and Maya, because in theory, like, nothing like that should happen to them, because they're not tied to their bodies in the same way that elves and men are tied to their bodies, right? They put on bodies as if they were just like kind of clothing, like we might put on clothing, and they can take that clothing off if they want. Now, there's something to be said about what happens to these figures as they do more evil in the guise and like kind of in their bodies, and it kind of becomes more and more a part of them in that way. But even then, I'm not really sure that was. We just don't have much precedent for saying that like that's what's going to happen to them. For example, Morgoth, we know he's shut beyond the walls of the world at the end of the First Age. Exactly what that looks like, we're not sure, but that's what happens to him. So I don't know that it was up to Mondos necessarily to judge these divine beings. It almost makes me wonder think that for the divine beings, that their judgment was ultimately in the hands of Iluvatar himself, right? So it could be that with Sauron and Saruman, their kind of the essence of who they were is kind of like dissipated, throughout the world. So I guess I prefer sort of an idea of that they're dissipated, right? Their power is dissipated. Now, maybe they've got some kind of like, vastly reduced ability to still do evil throughout the world, but it's not concentrated in the same power that it was before necessarily. They're almost like, like kind of the Barrow-wights, or like these wraithish figures right now. That answer seems to make a lot of sense to me. Like they're just kind of this mist, this further disembodied mist that's floating throughout the world. I don't make too much of the word nothing there. I think nothing is just, kind of how it's perceived, right? But the important thing is that neither of them really have any power on the level that they did before, right? Both of these figures, Saruman, both being very powerful figures, no longer having the power on the level that they did before. So that's my take on it, Andrew. It's a really interesting question. It's one of those I'd love to ask Tolkien if he was available to us to ask. But I think, I feel pretty good about that answer. That they're not necessarily fated to go to Mondos for judgment like elves would be. Now, again, maybe I'm wrong. Could be a big legendarium fail right there, but that's my take on it. So let me know if anybody has further feedback. Would love to be shown further information that would help get to the bottom of this question. Thanks a lot, Andrew. Really appreciate you. All right. Well, that's it for this episode. Please leave us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts, and drop us a line. You can correspond with us in a number of ways: YouTube, TolkienRoad.com, email at TolkienRoadPodcast@gmail.com, or on Twitter at TolkienRoad. Wherever you can find us, we'll do our best to respond to you somehow and at some point. All right. Thank you to our amazing patrons, especially the following: John R., Kaitlyn of Tea with Tolkien, Jacob Lockham, John H., Eru27, Emilio P., Jonathan D., Mike M, Robert H, Paul D, Julia, Werty, JoeBagelMan, Jacob S, Richard K, Matt R, Matthew W, Garret P, Chris K, John W, Eugene D, Chris B, Daniel S, Seb M, Shana Supreme, Ms. Anonymous, Andrew T, Redhawk, Shannon S, Brian O, Zeke F, James L, Chris L, Chuck F, Asya V, Ish of the Hammer, Teresa C, David of Pints with Jack, Eric B, and Johanna T. All right. Thank you all so much for your support. Truly appreciate all of our patrons. And thanks to everybody for watching and or listening. We will talk at you next time. Bye-bye.